Eileen Reavey from the National Popular Vote. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's really nice to meet all of you. I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen here. There we go. So yeah, thank you, Nancy, for making time for me to present to this group. I appreciate it. Been talking to a lot of different league affiliates, particularly around Michigan recently, as we work on our bill there. So to start it off with what Nancy kind of said in the beginning, how should we elect the president? Our organization firmly believes in the principle of one person, one vote. Whoever gets the most votes should win the presidency. We should get rid of this system where someone can come in second place in the popular vote, but still end up in the Oval Office. And we should get rid of the system where candidates are campaigning in only a handful of states every election cycle, instead of all 50 states. Under a national popular vote, candidates will truly be incentivized to go everywhere. And the bill that I'm about to tell you about is endorsed by the League of Women Voters US and also the League of Women Voters of Michigan. So let's start off with how we elect the president now. You all are league members, so I'll go through this part pretty quickly because I'm sure you all know this. Of course, we use the Electoral College. So on election day, you and I cast our ballots for the candidates of our choice, but the real vote is when electors meet in December and cast their ballots. So there are 538 people whose votes actually decide the presidency. So states are allocated one electoral vote for every representative that they have in Congress. So every state has at least 3, because every state has at least 2 US senators and 1 member of the House. So to win the Electoral College and win the presidency, you need to win a majority of electoral votes. Currently, that number is 270. So that is why when we're all on election night watching the results, we're not looking at who is winning the popular vote. We're looking at how close is our candidate to getting to that 270 number. So who are these electors? Most of the time, people don't know. You all are active in politics in your state, so you might know who they are from the Democratic or Republican Party in the last election. But overall, most people have no idea who these electors are. So the US Constitution gives explicit power to the states to decide how their electors are chosen. So specifically, Article 2, Section 1 reads, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So state legislatures decide how to award their state's electoral votes. And this is a power that the Supreme Court has termed a plenary power or an absolute power of the states. So in 48 states and DC, including Michigan, states have opted to use what we call winner-take-all laws or statewide winner-take-all laws. What these laws say is that whoever wins the most votes in your state on election day is the winner of 100% of Michigan's electoral votes. So looking at this map is from the 2020 election. So in California, if and when the Democratic candidate received the most votes in California, President Joe Biden got all 55 of California's electoral votes. Same thing in Texas. At that time, President Trump received the most votes in Texas, so he got all 38 of Texas's electoral votes. So in that election, there were 6 million Californians who cast a ballot for Donald Trump, and there were 5.2 million Texans who cast a ballot for Joe Biden. And their votes were thrown out essentially at the state line because they did not vote with the majority in their state. And as a result, they had no representation at the Electoral College. So this is what happens all over the country, that you can win, a presidential candidate can win a state by even just 1 vote and get 100% of the electors for that state. So state law is how we end up with divergent elections, where the popular vote winner is the Electoral College loser. This leads to a lot of problems in our system. Most notably, the person who gets the least or less votes can end up in the White House. This has happened 5 times in our nation's history, which when you think about, how long our country's been around might not sound like a lot, but we've only had 46 presidents. So 10% of them getting into office after losing the popular vote is actually quite a high number. So we're all pretty familiar with when this happened during our lifetimes in 2000 and in 2016, and it happened 3 other times previously. Now, it is not just a fluke that it's happened, in 2000 and in 2016, so close together after not happening for 120 years. It happened both of those times because we are in an era of close elections. And if you just look at this century, the elections we've had from 2000 to 2020, we had 2 elections where the popular vote winner lost the Electoral College, and it very nearly happened 2 additional times. So in 2004, if 60,000 voters in Ohio had cast their ballots for John Kerry instead of George Bush, Kerry would have won Ohio and won the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote by a larger margin than Donald Trump did in 2016. So 60,000 votes in Ohio could have been more important than the 3 million, popular votes lead that George Bush had over Kerry in that election. And then, of course, the other time that this very nearly happened was 2020. We were less than 22,000 votes away from Donald Trump winning, rightfully so, and under the laws of our country, winning a second term as president, despite losing the popular vote by over 7 million votes. And that's because of these razor-thin margins in the battleground states. So the numbers were, 5,200 votes in Arizona, 5,900 votes in Georgia, and 10,300 votes in Wisconsin could have flipped the outcome of the election, despite such a big popular vote lead that Joe Biden had. So this system and the winner-take-all laws results in candidates really focusing their campaign on the states that they have a chance to win. This makes sense, right? We already know that the Democratic candidate knows, I'm going to win California, I'm going to win Washington, I'm going to win Oregon. They don't have to campaign there to make that happen. And similarly, the Republican candidate knows that there is no point in trying to campaign there either, because they're not going to be able to shift enough votes for them to get more than the Democratic candidate. So because of that winner-take-all law, most states are completely decided before the election even begins. We already know how, about 40 states are going to vote in the next presidential election. So as a result of this, the entire general election campaign comes down to a dozen or less battleground states or swing states every election. In 2012, the entire campaign was in just 12 states. And then 2/3 of the events were in just 4 states, Ohio, Florida, Virginia, and Iowa. And that's pretty common that it comes down to a certain kind of upper tier of battleground states every election cycle that, you might start off with 12, but by the time you get to late September or October, it's really the campaign is coming down to, 3 or 4 states. And what we see, so for example, in 2012, 12 of the 13 smallest states were completely ignored. Almost all of our rural and agricultural states, almost the entire South except for Florida, much of the Northeast. And we see similar patterns in 2016 and in 2020. In 2016, 94% of all events were in just 12 states, and 2/3 of those events were in just 6 states. And in 2020, same pattern holds. 96% of general election campaign events were in just a dozen battleground states. And the 2 kind of big states there in that last election were Florida and Pennsylvania. Those 2 states together received 37% of all general election campaign visits. So we see this, intense focus on these particular states because those are the states that have the opportunity to change the outcome of the election. Their electoral votes are up for grabs, whereas Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Oregon, Washington, we already know how those states are going to vote. And if you're looking at this map and see, 2016 is a little bit of an outlier where you've got more events spread out across the country. That is not because anyone thought, oh, maybe, Donald Trump thought maybe I can win California, because he's the one who did an event there and in Washington. That is because he was not your typical candidate. And during about the first half of his presidential election campaign, he really loves rallies. And so whenever he was doing a fundraiser somewhere, he wanted to also do a rally. So that is kind of why you see some of those events, because of course candidates are coming to states like California to fundraise, even if they're not asking for Californians' votes. But that kind of tapered off in the second half of his campaign, I think, as his advisors got around him and said, no, we really need to focus on the battleground states, which of course they did very effectively, because that is how he won. Another really big implication of the current way we elect the president is our Supreme Court. The executive branch has the ability to nominate our Supreme Court justices. And currently 5 of the 9 justices on the court were appointed by popular vote losers. So we all know that this has really big consequences for our nation and for policy. If I think some people often feel that the Supreme Court is a little bit out of step with the rest of the country. This is why, that we're not having a court that the people are really able to weigh in on, because when we choose the president, the person who we all choose and more of us might choose doesn't necessarily win. Other, big implications, candidates, and once, they're elected, they're very aware of which states are the states of most importance. It's not, oh, we're totally put our blinders on and don't pay attention to what states are going to help us win the White House. So you see this with discretionary federal grants, that battleground states received more discretionary federal grants worth more grant dollars. There's a study done by Dr. John Hudak at the Brookings Institute. And what this found, at the time of this study, that if Tennessee had been a battleground state, they would have received 300 more federal grants worth a total of $60 million every year that they were a battleground state. And sorry, Tennessee is the example because they were smack dab in the middle population-wise during this time period from all 50 states. Similarly, we see this happening with disaster declarations as well. Highly competitive swing states are twice as likely to get disaster declarations as our flyover states. You think that there'd be a lot of money, or excuse me, a lot of money does come with these declarations. And, I think that there'd be some sort of formula that we're punching in Congress saying, hey, how much infrastructure was impacted? How many resources are already on the ground? Was there, a compounding event somewhere else in the state? But no, at the end of the day, you can't ignore the fact that partisan politics are at play here when competitive swing states are getting twice as many disaster declarations. Similarly, we see this with policy being drafted, that not all 50 states' needs are necessarily what's being looked at. 2 examples here from both sides of the aisle. George Bush, when he was running for president, he proposed the No Child Left Behind Act. This was the largest federal action taken into public education in the history of our country. The federal government getting involved in something traditionally run by states is not what you would really expect from a Republican candidate to propose, right? But this policy was geared towards winning over education-minded voters in the critical battleground state of Ohio, aka our moms. When George Bush won, in part because of Ohio and of course Florida, he signed this law in effect in the Cincinnati suburbs. On the other side, President Obama, when he was running for re-election, he put forth a federal tax credit program promoting clean energy. Ohio companies got nearly 4 times the average that went to other states. So states that happen to be closely divided during an election year, they do benefit from being a battleground state. But it's really important to remember is that this varies from election to election. And the perks of being a battleground state are fleeting. You know, if you look at states like Virginia and Colorado, it wasn't that long ago that they were battleground states, and they pretty quickly moved to safe Democratic states and are completely ignored now in the presidential election. Certainly, you know, Michigan is a battleground state now, but it wasn't too long ago that you kind of fell off the map in, you know, the 2012 election. Very quickly, it was realized that President Obama was so far ahead, he was going to win. No more campaigning was happening on either side from the presidential level after that. Other big things that this really, you can look at taking effect is if we look at things like in 2020, the states that were making requests from the Federal Reserve for COVID resources for their states. So ventilators, masks, things like that. Colorado and Florida submitted their requests on the same day to the federal government. Florida got 100% of what they asked for. Colorado got 17% of what they asked for. There was actually a quote you know, a member of Trump's staff was quoted as saying, when asked about this, was why this was the case. It was, the president knows that Florida is important. They're very aware of this and what states are really going to help them win re-election. And I think President Trump was certainly very aware of that and kind of showcased that a little bit more than previous presidents. So this system overall is hurting the country. The candidate who wins less popular votes can and frequently does win the election. Every American's vote is not equal, and candidates are routinely ignoring the voters in at least 38 states. Looking ahead to 2024, we're expecting 40 states to be completely ignored in the election. And I see a question here, what is a safe state? So a safe state is essentially a non-battleground state. So we know how it's going to vote already. So for example, California is a safe state for a Democratic candidate because we know the Democrat's going to win the 2024 presidential election here. You know, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that the Republican candidate, whoever they are, is going to win those states. So those are what we consider safe states. So that brings us to how we should elect the president. So whoever gets the most votes, I think, should become the president. This is how we elect almost every other office in the country. And we are able to modernize our presidential elections to make every vote equal. And every vote being equal would mean that candidates would have to care about the entire population's interests, not just those in swing states. So we break that system where candidates are advocating for positions that poll well with swing voters and are only listening to the concerns of voters in a small number of states. Well, how we do this is with the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So this is an agreement among the states that guarantees the U.S. presidency to the candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states in D.C. So what our bill does is makes it so that if you win the popular vote, you are guaranteed to win the Electoral College. So this is a bill passed by states to change how the state participates in the Electoral College. So currently, Michigan state law says whoever gets the most votes in Michigan gets our electors. We replace that with whoever gets the most votes in all 50 states in DC wins the electors from Michigan. Really importantly, this bill only gets triggered into effect in all of the member states when states with at least 270 electoral votes have signed on. At that time, when you have 270, that's the number you need to win the presidency. So when you get 270 electors committed to the national popular vote winner, you are guaranteeing the outcome. So hopefully Michigan will pass this bill this year. And we don't expect, frankly, it to be in effect by the 2024 election. So the law will kind of sit on the books. It will be there, but it won't be in place yet. So in the 2024 election, it'll still be whoever wins the most votes in Michigan gets the electoral votes. And until we get to that 270 mark, which hopefully we will by the 2028 election. So we are about 70% of the way towards making this happen across the country. So we have passed this bill in 15 states and DC with 195 electoral votes. So we currently have bills in about a dozen state legislatures, including Michigan, and are really excited about some of the prospects that we have. In particular, Michigan and Minnesota we're very hopeful are going to both pass in the next few months here. That would be 25 additional electoral votes. That's a huge chunk of what we have remaining to get, because we need 75 more electoral votes for the bill to go into effect. So if we can knock that number down to 50 in the next couple of months, that is a great win for us. And then after that, we'll continue working in states across the country. We're looking at Maine, North Carolina, Arizona, Pennsylvania, kind of all over the country where we've had some progress before, like you can see on this map. And there are a lot of misconceptions that people often have about this. Number one is thinking that this is a partisan bill, but it's not. This bill is not a reaction to the 2016 election. And our organization was in existence a full decade before Donald Trump was elected. So it's not about him or any particular candidate. It's not a left or a right issue. It's an American issue that all voters can and should get behind. That it's a simple concept. Whoever gets the most votes wins. That shouldn't be Democratic or Republican, right? That's just a straightforward principle that we should all be able to agree on. And it is constitutional. As I talked about at the beginning, this is an explicit power of the states to decide how their electors are chosen. And if you think about it, the same authority that allows Michigan to do what you do now is what allows you to join the National Popular Vote Compact. So it's the states can do kind of however they want. And so they can currently what they do, say whoever gets the most votes in our state gets our electoral votes. Maine and Nebraska use a little bit of a different system. They award electors on a congressional district basis. So whoever wins the most votes within each district gets one elector. They're allowed to do that because of these same 17 words in the Constitution. And so what we're doing is using the power granted to the states in the Constitution by the framers in order to achieve a national popular vote. Another question about constitutionality that often comes up is around congressional consent. Because if you're looking at this and thinking, hey, don't all interstate compacts have to be approved by Congress? Technically, that's what, yes. So Article 1, Section 10 says that of the U.S. Constitution says that congressional consent is required for interstate compacts. However, there's over 100 years of Supreme Court precedent that congressional consent is only necessary for compacts that encroach upon federal supremacy. So this does not encroach upon federal supremacy because awarding electors is explicitly a state power in the Constitution. So we don't believe that we will need congressional consent for this issue. Now, if after we've reached 270 electoral votes, the Supreme Court decides to overturn 100 years of precedent and say that we need consent, that's okay. That does not end our effort. That is just one more thing we have to do. And we will lobby Congress on this issue the same way that we have lobbied state legislators in all 50 states. And states are able to withdraw from the compact. However, it's really important to note that they cannot do so between a 6-month blackout period around the election. You would not want a state to be able to pull out at the last minute and completely, turn the election into chaos and upend the results. So states, even if a state legislature passes a bill to remove themselves from the compact, the day before the election, it cannot go into effect until after Inauguration Day, January 20th of the following year. And this is something that's not, enforced by us or a governor of any particular state, but it's enforced by the impairments clause of the U.S. Constitution. And no state in the history of our republic has ever left an interstate compact without adhering to the terms of the compact. So they are kind of once they've signed on to it, the state is bound to the agreements of that term. And for an interstate compact, it's kind of easy to just think of it as a contract. This is how states get into agreements with each other. The same way, you know, if I were selling you a car, we both sign the same contract. In doing that, this is the same thing that states do. It's also why our bill is the exact same in every state that it's introduced. So it's the same 888 words in all 15 states that have, and DC, that have signed on so far. And another question that often comes up is, you know, what would the founders of the country think of this? I think it's good to talk about kind of the real history of how we got the electoral college system that we have today. Honestly, it wasn't, this grand design of this is the perfect way to elect the president, and we all agree that this is the only way to do it. No, they could not decide how to elect the president. They took 30 votes over 22 separate days on this issue, going back and forth on different methods of electing the president. Ultimately, they came up with the concept of electors choosing the president. Then they were still debating how those electors would be chosen and still couldn't agree. And so ultimately they said, it was literally at the Conference of Unfinished Business. It was one of the very last things decided at the when they were drafting the Constitution. And they said, we'll do electors and we'll leave it up to the state legislatures. They're the closest body to the people. They can decide how their electors are chosen for their state. So the current system is nothing like it was at the founding of our country, right? In the first presidential election, only 5 states allowed citizens to vote for the president in any form. It wasn't until the 10th election for president that a majority of states used the winner-take-all laws that we're familiar with today. And notably, those winner-take-all laws, they were not debated at the Constitutional Convention. They weren't thought of. They're not in the Federalist Papers. They're not mentioned anywhere, and they're not one of the many ways that were voted on. So the winner-take-all law system that we have now, that's not what we had at the founding of the country. So what the founders did create was a system where the states get to decide, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're using the constitutional authority left to the state legislatures to have a better way to elect the president. Another question that often comes up is around the idea that small population states will be hurt by this proposal. But small states don't benefit from the current system. It's a natural thing to think that they do, and that comes from the math around how electors are awarded. Because, you know, if you take the lowest population state like Wyoming, they have 3 electors because they're 2 US senators and they're 1 House member, and they have to turn out less voters per elector than any other state. And so you might think, ooh, they have extra clout. But because of the winner-take-all laws that states have chosen to use, that mathematical advantage that they could have had, they gave away. Once they passed that winner-take-all law, that they kind of equalized the playing field. So currently, the 13 smallest states with 14 smallest states now with 3 or 4 electoral votes are the most disadvantaged group of states under the winner-take-all system. And that's not because they're small, it's just because those smaller population states are more homogenous and are, as you can see here, they're decidedly Republican or decidedly Democratic. None of them are swing states currently. And so we're not hearing, you know, so goes Delaware, so goes the nation. None of those states are ones that you see as big battleground states. So under the current system, power comes from being a closely divided battleground state, and all of the small states are essentially non-competitive in the presidential election. And they're not ignored because of their low population. They're ignored because they're not battleground states. And similarly, another concern is that big states are just going to control the election, you know, that candidates are just going to campaign in California and New York. California and New York are only 18% of the US population. So people really are all over the United States. 2, national popular vote makes every vote equal regardless of where it is cast. So yes, candidates are going to campaign, and sometimes they're going to make campaign stops in bigger population centers, but they're going to go all over because the American population truly is all over the country. And if you add up, there are 14 states that are all voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election, that they have a roughly, when you equivalent population to California, when you pull them all together, their vote totals in the 2016 election were very similar, what they led for Trump versus the lead that Hillary Clinton had in California. So when you add up all of those states, imagine them as just one state. It would be silly to think that they would be ignored, right? Because they're the same population and have the same amount of people as California. So just because they happen to be spread out between different states doesn't mean that they're going to be ignored. Candidates are going to go everywhere because every vote matters under a national popular vote. So a way I like to summarize this is that people being ignored based on where they happen to live, that's what happens now, and that's what we get rid of under a national popular vote. Same thing with big cities. That's another thing that people think, well, okay, that all sounds well and good, but they're just going to go to our big cities. And honestly, I think people think that our cities are a lot bigger than they actually are. If you add up our 100 biggest cities in this country, it still only makes up 19.6% of the American population. So that's a really, 20%, that's an important chunk of the population. And it's actually very similar to the amount of Americans that live in rural America as defined by the US Census. That's also 20%. So you wouldn't just campaign to the people in the big cities and expect to win any more than you would just campaign to rural voters and expect to win. You need to talk to both groups, and very importantly, to the 60% of Americans that live in the suburbs in between. So under a national popular vote, candidates are going to be incentivized to go in all 50 states because every voter will be relevant in presidential elections for the very first time. And we know that within battleground states, this is what happens now. Every vote is equal within Michigan when it is a battleground state. And the candidates don't just go to Detroit and Lansing and Ann Arbor. They, with surgical precision, go where the population is. So yes, they might do 2 or 3 events in Detroit, but they're still going up into all over the state because they know that they have the opportunity to win votes there. So kind of in summary here, the National Popular Vote Bill guarantees the presidency to the candidate with the most votes. So every voter in every state will be politically relevant for the first time in our presidential elections. This bill has been endorsed by a number of organizations. So these are some of our national supporters you can see here. And then this is actually our coalition in Michigan specifically. So this includes the League of Women Voters of Michigan, so thank you, as well as a lot of other groups that you can kind of see here, the NAACP, ACLU, Common Cause, Voters Not Politicians, Statewide Indivisible Michigan, and the Michigan Democratic Party. So we've been working to build a strong coalition in Michigan. And next, I'll tell you kind of just about our where we are so far. Just going to mute myself for a second and take a sip of water. Excuse me. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough. Okay, in Michigan. So we were really excited to have our bill was introduced last Wednesday. We had a press conference that the league participated in announcing our bill. So we have 2 companion bills. House Bill 4156, sponsored by Representative Carrie Reinigans, and Senate Bill 126, sponsored by Senator Stephanie Chang. So those bills are identical. The House bill is moving first. We had our hearing earlier this week, just on Tuesday. There was really great turnout. The overflow room was even packed. So there was a number of people that turned out to support. Really good opportunity to present testimony on the bill. And so I think that was a helped get a lot of really good attention around it. So currently, that we can expect to be voted on in about another 10 days to be voted out of committee, and then it'll go to the floor. So we really, I am hopeful that you all hear this presentation and are, want to be supportive of this. The number one thing you can do is go to this website, nationalpopularvote.com/MI, and you just put in your zip code and you can write a letter to your state legislator, both the rep and the senator, asking them to take action on National Popular Vote. We need people hearing from this from all over the state, even people that are already on board with the bill. We need them hearing that this is an important issue for the people of Michigan. We have a unique opportunity this year and need to make sure, honestly, that we get this passed this year. Our organization is nonpartisan, but since the 2016 election, we really know that our bill does better when Democrats have gavels in hand. And of course, as you all know, Michigan now has flipped to a Democratic trifecta, and there is a lot of what I consider to be really good legislation that's passing right now in your state. And we need to make sure that this is one of those items. We cannot have this be something that gets pushed off to a future session. That is something legislators try and say sometimes when they look at this is, well, you're not at 270, so we don't need to do this now. We can do this in a future session. And frankly, we cannot wait. We've been working on this bill in Michigan for over a decade. The first time it passed was back in 2009. Actually, it was in 2008, excuse me. And so we've had a presence in one way or another since then in Michigan. We need to get Michigan passed, get your 15 electoral votes on board so that we can move on to the next kind of group of states that are looking at this. So really hopeful that you'll pass it this year, as well as Minnesota with their 10 electoral votes. And I think that is, I will stop there and open it up for questions.